my pleasure to introduce our today's speaker, our colleague and friend Tomáš Hříbek from the Department of Philosophy of the Academy of Sciences of Czech Republic, or Institute of Philosophy of the Academy of Sciences of Czech Republic at the Department of Analytical Philosophy. Tomáš is an expert on philosophy of mind, analytical philosophy, philosophy of language, but his today's lecture talk is going to be about the topic of qualia, and it's going to be critical about the very idea of qualia, as the title suggests, which is against qualophilia.
So how many people here are proficient in the Czech language, or fluent, or native speakers? Alright, so few people.
Also, Preston is proficient.
Few people. Alright, so I thought I wrote it here. But yeah, anyway. So, well, this is based on a chapter from a book in the Czech language that I published before the summer holidays, half a year ago or so. Which has this curious title, which can be translated into English as "What It's Like" or "What It's About," and also it can be translated into the Polish language as follows. But this is from a presentation in Warsaw last June, so I wanted to entertain the Polish colleagues. But at any rate, the title, the slightly enigmatic title, suggests two major approaches in contemporary philosophy of consciousness. One based on the idea that there is some special property of consciousness which might be understood and which might be characterized as what its likeness, raw feel, phenomenality, or whatnot. And that's what we need to explain, how it fits within the material universe. And the other approach is that consciousness is not so much a matter of some feeling, but rather what we report about consciousness, what we say about consciousness, which is basically Dennett's approach. So I guess I cover both of these approaches, and I tend to agree with the one that reduces consciousness to reports about consciousness, basically the Dennettian approach, but also there are some extensions and some developments of some of the arguments that you can find in Dennett. So to that extent, I guess the book, my ambition was that at the same time the book can serve as an introduction covering a lot of material within the contemporary philosophy of consciousness of the last, let's say, quarter of century or so, but also its contribution to some of these debates. So today I'll concentrate on what might be considered to be the original contribution. This is the kind of table that opens the book, right? Well, that's how I see the conceptual geography in the contemporary philosophy of consciousness. That two basic positions are realism and physicalism breaks down to a posteriori and a priori kind, and then there are two positions, phenomenism and representationism or representationalism, that cut across the division between dualism and physicalism. And you might wonder, where is Russellian monism? Well, I have a chapter on Russellian monism as well in the book, but I think that position is unstable, and that there are Russellian monisms that are indeed monisms of even physicalist kind, but then there are other Russellian monisms that are not really monisms, but the old-fashioned dualism all the way down. So I don't think that Russellian monism has to be recognized in this table, and this is how I fill the blank slots, right? That there are dualist phenomenist, Chalmers, Jackson, and Tyler Birch. There are dualist representationists. Descartes is the only person from way back in the table, right? Descartes. But I think there are some contemporary philosophers like Adam Kautz at Brown University who falls into that dualist representationist slot. I think Descartes is a prime example because he thought, I mean, his terminology is kind of unstable, but I mean, Descartes was somebody who said that, right? Then who understood conscious states as states that represent reality, right? Although they are the kind of states that they are not physical states, they are not material states, they are sui generis, right? So Descartes' inclusionist, I guess, self-understood that he's a dualist representationist. But phenomenonists are people who think that you cannot reduce states of consciousness to their representational function, right? They cannot be reduced to representational function. And then there are, and that's, I mean, there are not so many dualists, obviously, for obvious reasons, right? Materialism or physicalism has been dominant in the last half century or so. So I mostly deal with the varieties of physicalism, both a posteriori and a priori. And I won't say much about this distinction because it's I found in the literature that there is a lot of consensus, but still, even this basic distinction between these two sorts of physicalism, there are groups of people that understand these terms differently. So I'll put that aside. But at any rate, Ned Block is a posteriori physicalist phenomenist, right? And David Lewis is a priori physicalist phenomenist, and then a posterior physicalist representationism falls into two kinds: transparentist, Bretsky, and anti-transparentist, Rosenthal, and then lastly a priori physicalist representationalist, Dennett and Beerbohm and maybe Schmitz-Gebel and I don't know others. So anyway, so this is the, like, a lot of the book is kind of conceptual geography, and it's tendentious, it's selective because there is so much material. Right? This is one of the liveliest areas in philosophical research in the last quarter century or so. But I tried to put it into some system. But at any rate, this is the scheme. That's how I fill out the. This is my conceptual geography at any rate, all right. So I should concentrate on that business about qualia. And when I tried to Google, in Google Images, I typed in qualia. This is what I got. That it's apparently some resort in Bora Bora or somewhere off the coast of New Zealand or Australia or whatever. Some luxurious resort where, but I mean, in a way, it's not inaccurate because look at the blueness of the blue ocean, and I'm sure the smells of the fresh air and the blue skies above, and all manner of experiences with these features that you can get. So anyway, so this is qualia resort, but it's not, well, it's not exactly, I guess, what people mean in the literature. So. All right, so I will have to read some parts of this text because it gets complicated in to some extent, and it's mostly based on a later chapter in the book, chapter 6, but by way of what should I add? By way of contextualizing or introduction, is that there is so much of this literature, so where to start? So it's eventually, after some time, you realize that, this has been my impression anyway, that although there is this richness and diversity of varieties of positions that is, you know, as you might have noticed in the little table that I compiled, a lot of people seem to agree that some consensus at least has been reached in this domain of philosophy, of philosophical research. Namely, people at least agree on the explanandum, what is on the target phenomenon, right? That should be explained. That needs explaining, right? And so, because I mean, we talk about consciousness and awareness and unconsciousness and class consciousness even, right? We talk about consciousness in so many contexts in everyday life as well as in scientific psychology, but all of these contexts are rather imprecise, all of these meanings are rather imprecise. So a lot of people in philosophy of consciousness think that at least we've come to agree on the target phenomenon, and the terminology is not exactly stable, but a lot of people think that what needs explaining in the domain of philosophy of consciousness is what they call phenomenal character, or sometimes some other people prefer the term qualitative character, or sometimes simply qualia, right? Qualium, singular, qualia, plural. And these are proper. I prefer, again, like this is not quite stable, but I try to think of qualia and phenomenal characters and qualitative characters as properties, right? Ontologically, I classify them as properties. So they are properties of experience, right? And the dispute is about whether these properties are ultimately physical, right? Somehow they fit within the physical universe, ultimately physical universe, or they are sui generis, they are something extra, right? So physicalism, dualism, that's how you get the basic distinction. So a lot of people within this domain of philosophical research at least agree that when it comes to consciousness, this is what we mean. We mean properties of experience that we will call qualitative characters, phenomenal characters, or whatnot, or qualia. They need to be explained how they fit within the physical universe. And the older article by David Chalmers, I think from 1995, is helpful here because he says something. Well, I'm going to exaggerate. He doesn't give you some ridiculous percentages, but basically, I guess it can be understood as saying that 95% of what we are saying about consciousness can be given a reductive explanation. Phenomena that we often consider to be conscious phenomena or belonging within this domain of consciousness. Phenomena like attention, perception, memory, right? All these can be taken care of by some sort of reductive explanation using representational concepts, using representation. I'm using representational as synonymous with intentional, right? So representational or intentional concepts, and these can be, and representational concepts can be taken care of by means of functional and ultimately causal concepts. And when you succeed, when you go as far as that, you've succeeded in naturalizing these phenomena like attention, memory, perception, and so on. You found a slot for them within the physical universe, right? Because the rest of the universe is described in these like causal and causal terms. So So you've succeeded you've succeeded with 95% of material, right? I'm making this up, but Chalmers can be understood like that. Maybe 99% of material, right? That can be understood as belonging within the domain of consciousness. But then there is 1% or 5%, whatever, a very small area, right, which cannot be taken care of by means of reductive explanation, and that's phenomenal character or qualitative character or qualia or whatnot, right? And that's an extra, right? That is irreducible by means of that reductive terminology, and that causes a problem, right? And then we have to devise. If we care for materialism or physicalism, we have to find a way of somehow reducing this material so that it fits within the physical universe somehow as well, after all. Or if we don't succeed, then we end up being dualists or something. Alright, so what about these phenomenal characters, qualitative characters? So, I mean, the terminology goes back at least, I guess in modern literature, goes back at least as far as early 70s, that paper by Thomas Nagel about the consciousness of bats, right? What it's like to be different kind of creature that we, and of course Thomas Nagel's suggestion was that we can never find a description from a third person, which means scientific, objective point of view, that would capture that aspect of a creature of a different kind, the experience of the creature of that very different kind. But of course, in more recent literature, it goes back to that paper that I just mentioned, the paper by David Chalmers, and then of course his 1996 book, The Conscious Mind. So what are these? So what else can we say about these phenomenal characters? They are considered to be intrinsic to the mind, meaning they cannot be taken care of in relational terms. Because again, that would be a way of including them within the physicalist picture of the universe, right? So they are intrinsic, ineffable, right? We lack vocabulary. We don't have words to express what it's like to smell the, I don't know, freshly ground coffee, or to, I don't know, experience the blueness of the ocean at Bora Bora Resort or something. Indescribable, private, right? Private or subjective, we might say, rather than publicly accessible. And my description of my experiences cannot be corrected by somebody else, so they are incorrigible. So this is what. Right, and some of these properties could play representational role. Representationalists in the philosophy of consciousness think so. Ned Block uses the term mental paint for those properties of conscious experience that can play a representational role. He calls them mental paint. But he also distinguishes something that he calls mental oil, right? And mental oil is those properties of conscious experiences that don't play the representational role. And then again, so a lot of people think that there is agreement, at least as far as the target phenomenon within this area of philosophical research is concerned, right? We know what we are talking about. We only disagree about whether this phenomenon can be, whether a place can be found for it within the basically physicalist description of things, scheme of things, or not, right? Also, a lot of people would agree with an older argument by Dennett that denies these features to conscious experiences that I just listed, namely intrinsicness, privacy, incorrigibility, ineffability. Right? A lot of people agree with Dennett that this is to go too far, like to ascribe these particle approaches. But they think that even if you forget about these demanding features, that there will be something left which might be called phenomenal character, what is likeness or whatnot, that needs explaining. So my argument is basically an extension of Dennett's argument, because a lot of people agreed with Dennett. They said, Dennett, thank you for disabusing us of qualia. We agreed that qualia don't exist, but most people say, but there are phenomenal characters after all. There is something left after we've taken care of qualia. There is something left, namely phenomenal characters or qualitative characters and so on. And we want to keep those, and those are the target phenomenon that needs to be taken care of by means of physicalist explanation, some sort of reductive explanation. So they differ, most people differ from Dennett to the extent that they recognize phenomenal characters as something which is left after you've done the quiening, right, procedure on qualia. And my argument is that we can extend Dennett's strategy to phenomenal characters as well, so phenomenal characters will be gone as well. So let me remind you first of the original argument of Dennett's from 1988. It's quite old, right? So 1988, he published this paper called Quiening Qualia. Quiening, that means that it's derived from the name of Willard Quine, who had rather, what was it called, desert-style ontology, like desert landscape ontology. Right? There is not much in Dennett's ontology, right? So Dennett suggested that qualia would be one of those things that we can get rid of, right? We don't need that in our ontology, right? So he wants to quine qualia, right? So and the problem with Dennett, I guess he writes beautifully, but usually his writings don't include what we are used to call arguments. So they mostly consist of stories and suggestive stories and metaphors and analogies and so on. So I'll use one of those stories, and then I'll give you what I think is the form of that argument. But it's rather complicated, but I'll give it a simplified form eventually. So he says, let's imagine that there are two professional coffee tasters, Mr. Chase and Mr. Sanborn, whose work consists in making sure that the taste of certain brand of coffee stays consistent. Both agree that the taste of this brand has not changed, yet they do not enjoy their job anymore. Each has a different explanation of this, however. Chase says that the coffee still tastes the same, but he does not like this brand anymore. This is a quote from Dennett, quoting Mr. Chase. I no longer like it, he cries, Mr. Chase cries. My tastes have changed. I've become more sophisticated coffee drinker. I no longer like that taste at all. Right. End of quote. Sanborn reacts to this revelation as follows. Again, quoting from Dennett, quoting this fictional character, Mr. Sanborn. It's funny you should mention it, he replied, for something rather similar has happened to me. But my tastes haven't changed. My tasters, the taste buds, I guess, have changed. End of quote from Dennett's paper. If we were, I guess, let me comment on this. So if we were to use the standard language whose relevance Dennett questions, we should interpret the disagreement between these two tasters, between these two professional tasters, Mr. Chase and Mr. Sanborn, as such. Chase claims that his experience has the very same phenomenal properties it used to have in the past, but his attitude towards these properties has changed. By contrast, Mr. Sanborn thinks that the very phenomenal qualities of his experience have altered. Dennett rejects both of these explanations. It is not possible to identify any precise moment at which a given experience arrives or at which its character changes. Of Of course, Dennett does not deny that Chase and Sanborn both go through a series of complex changes from the first stimulation of taste buds up to the final behavioral and verbal reaction. However, it is impossible to isolate in this series any introspectable mental event of tasting the coffee, which is then the subject of a variety of reactions and more or less imprecise characterizations. It is more likely that our experience is a result of our behavior, such as our drinking of the coffee, our verbal reactions, memories, developing impressions, and behavioral dispositions. The correct solution of the dispute between Chase and Sanborn is suggested in the comment by Chase's wife, quoting from Dennett. "Don't be silly. As soon as you have dislike, you change the nature of the experience." Dennett thus concludes that the respective experiences of Chase and Sanborn do not exhibit any ineffable, intrinsic, private, and incorrigible properties that should be the target of a prospective explanation. Now, I'll develop what I've already suggested or announced earlier. It turns out that most contemporary materials, which means most philosophers, because most philosophers in contemporary philosophy of consciousness turn out to be materialists of one sort or another, most of them agree with Dennett in disliking qualia in this sense, since these entities just don't look like properties that could be explained by means of functional and representational terms. That is, the usual tools of reductive explanation. As soon as we think of a property as essentially intrinsic, it can be hardly handled by means of causal concepts. If it is irreducibly subjective, it is inaccessible to an objective description, etc. In other words, materialists don't like qualia, since qualia, since the latter, do not look like the kind of properties that could be identified or reduced to, identified with or reduced to some physical properties, which is what the ambition of materialism consists in. However, many contemporary materialists are at the same time hopeful that it should be possible to identify a mental property which would be identical with or supervenient on or whatever other close relation between mental and physical. You want to come up with some physical properties, as they dub this mental property: phenomenal character, raw feel, what is likeness, etc. And it turns out that contemporary dualists identified the target phenomenon for philosophy of consciousness in exactly, whose character is the matter of dispute, in exactly the same manner. Does it then mean that phenomenal character is the desired explanandum that each party agrees on? At any rate, there is evidence in the writings of contemporary materialists that they agree with Dennett, at least in denying the intrinsicness, ineffability, irreducible subjectivity, and incorrigibility to consciousness. What this means is that they deny the traditional notion of qualia. At the same time, however, these same materialists try hard to save a space for some sort of limited concept of qualia, and I shall call these newfangled, limited, attenuated, diluted, or whatever qualia. I will call them deflationary qualia, as opposed to traditional ones that were the subject of Dennett's critique that we might call inflationary, right? Because they have these features that most people nowadays agree on: intrinsicness, ineffability, and so on. Right? They are inflationary. Right? So deflationary qualia, according to most contemporary people, supposedly like the problematic qualities of intrinsicness, ineffability, subjectivity, etc. But they keep their, what is it, phenomenality. So let's see, right? What is there anything left? So I mean, I guess you can already sense the logic here that I'm going to argue that there is not really anything left, right? Once you've taken care of these problematic features, there is nothing left. There is nothing to phenomenal character. So you would have to start philosophy of consciousness from a different angle, which is something that I think Dennett does, and I devote like a chapter to sort of like hopefully clear presentation of Dennett's alternative view, but that's not my topic today. So, all right. So typical among those, or one of the first, I think already, among those who interpreted Dennett in the way that I just suggested, that said, thank you, Professor Dennett, for finding qualia, but let me keep some attenuated or diluted qualia nevertheless. One of the first ones in this group was Owen Flanagan, philosopher and neurobiologist, in his book, 1993 book called Consciousness Reconsidered, which includes one of the first rather detailed analyses of Dennett's paper from 1988. And he, I mean, already Flanagan also refers not just to finding qualia paper, but also to Dennett's book from 1991, Consciousness Explained, right? Which, I mean, he has the advantage of being able to use that book that was published in the meantime. So, all right. So in that book, in Consciousness Explained, Dennett offers a kind of, or another variety of his elimination argument by means of an analogy between a need to get rid of qualia on the one hand, and a need to let go of a kite which is attached to snarled rope, right? Snarled kite, right? So you want to get rid of that. It's kind of analogous to trying to get rid of qualia. So Dennett says this. Dennett says, quote, when your kite string gets snarled up, in principle it can be unsnarled, especially if you're patient and analytic. But there is a point beyond which principle lapses and practicality triumphs. Some snarls should be abandoned, right? So he suggests that qualia are like snarls, and some snarls are just so damn complicated. It's just leave it aside rather than trying to bother with it. So that's what he says, but at the same time he writes, but there are some kites that we should keep that are not snarled, and those are those qualia in the attenuated sense. So Flanagan writes, the problem is that two distinct strings have gotten ensnarled. One string is attached to an ordinary box kite that announces that there are certain ways things seem. The other string is attached to a gaudy kite that ostentatiously flies banners announcing that the ways things seem consist of sense of atomic, non-relational states that possess ineffable properties known deeply, incorrigibly, and exclusively from the first-person point of view, right? So, and Dennett believes that this picture, this analogy, already suggests a solution. We can immediately, that's another quote from Flanagan, we can immediately improve matters by freeing the box kite from the extraneous one tangled up with it, the one that is immodestly depicts qualia as possessing special problematic features, being atomic, ineffable, and incorrigible, accessible from the first-person point of view. Ditch the second kite, but let the first kite flying again once it's freed. The box kite announces on one face that qualia are the ways things seem. The fact is that it is a box kite. The fact that it is a box kite helps to capture the idea that qualia have depth and hidden structure. Furthermore, the box kite flies no extraneous banners committing it to problematic properties. Qualia, as they are depicted on the box kite, can have other properties than those available in the first person. This is ruled out by the banners the second kite flies. Right. So basically, Flanagan says there is the modest kite and the immodest kite. The immodest kite, that's the analogy with qualia that Dennett helped us to get rid of. So get rid of that one, but keep the immodest kite, and this is the qualia with some attenuated or diluted, or I would say deflationary sense, and we can keep that one, and that's our target phenomenon. Also, so Owen Flanagan, all right, and then you find similar quotes in people, you know, representing very different positions within philosophy of consciousness. So, for instance, Michael Tai, who represents something that I deal with it in a lot of detail in the book, something called a version of first-order representational theory, right? So he thinks that conscious states they can be reduced to representational states of the first order, right? And he says this in his book from 2002 called Consciousness, Color, and Content. He says, if we stipulate that something is a visual phenomenon quality or a qualia, only if it is a directly accessible quality of an experience, then there are no visual phenomenal qualities or qualia, right? So, to that so you might add, like, to that extent I agree with Dennett, right? You might add. But he goes on. Still, there are qualities of which the subjects of visual experiences are directly aware via introspection. They are qualities of external surfaces and volumes and films, if they are qualities of anything. These qualities, by entering into the appropriate representational contents of visual experiences, contribute to the phenomenal character of the experiences. Thus, they may reasonably be called phenomenal qualities in a less restrictive sense of the term. Right? So again, same, well, he uses different language, different terminology, but again he distinguishes two things, something like what you might call inflationary qualia and deflationary qualia, and he says, let's get rid of the former and keep the latter. Right? Very different theorists from Owen Flanagan in other respects. Another example, Peter Carothers, who also is also a representationalist among materialists, but he's of a higher order sort. Right, so he disagrees with Michael Tai on a lot of things, but here's what he says about qualia. He says, many philosophers use the term qualia liberally to refer to those properties of mental states, whatever they may be, in virtue of which the states in question are phenomenally conscious. On this usage, qualia, subjective field, and what is likeness are all just rotational variants of one another. And on this usage, it is beyond dispute that there are such things as qualia. Right? It is beyond dispute that I would call these deflationary qualia. But he goes on. I propose myself to use the term qualia much more restrictively. All right, I'm sorry. The first, the last sentence that I just read, it was incomplete. It was supposed to be that it is beyond dispute that there are no such things as qualia. All right. So these are inflationary qualia again in my terminology. Let's get rid of this. But he goes on. I propose myself to use the term qualia much more restrictively, as some other writers use it, to refer to those putative, intrinsic, and non-representational properties of mental. I take it back. The previous sentence, the last one in the last paragraph that I read was correct. It is beyond dispute that there are such things as qualia, right? But he says, right, the paragraph that I'm now reading is about inflationary qualia. I propose myself to use the term qualia much more restrictedly to refer to those putative, intrinsic, and non-representational properties of mental states in virtue of which the latter are phenomenally conscious. On this usage, it is not beyond dispute that there are such things as qualia. Alright, so in this paragraph, he's questioning inflationary qualia, but in the previous paragraph, he said that, of course, there are states, they have properties by means of which they are phenomenally conscious. All right. So, but similar distinction to Tai, to the one that Tai makes in using somewhat different language in the previous quote, similar to Flanagan, right? And lastly, Ned Block, right, who is not even representationalist, so he disagrees with both Tai and Carothers. He does not think that you can reduce conscious states to representational states, right? So he's a phenomenist, right? A phenomenist. And yet he also defends a certain concept of attenuated or deflationary qualia. He says this: I take a qualitative character of or qualia as a phenomenal property of an experience that eludes the intentional, the functional, and the purely cognitive. Phenomenal character is a more neutral term that carries no commitment to qualia. Both the representationist and the phenomenist can agree that there are phenomenal characters, even though the former, but not the latter, thinks phenomenal characters are wholly representational. Right? So, it seems that that the current debate in philosophy of consciousness has indeed arrived at some consensus that that we have a target phenomenon, and we can thank Dennett for helping us to zoom in onto really diluted or attenuated version of that phenomenon, right? It doesn't have some extra properties that we used to ascribe to it, right? So so there is a consensus concerning the target phenomenon, which requires explaining. True materialists or physicalists still disagree with dualists as to the nature of this target phenomenon. The materialists employ the whole arsenal of representational, functional, ultimately causal terms in order to demonstrate that the target phenomenon is physical. They just try to reduce consciousness in terms of by means of the concept of access consciousness, as Bloch calls it. The dualists, on the other hand, reject all such reductions and consider the target phenomenon to be sui generis. Yet both groups have, or so they believe, the same property of consciousness in mind, namely phenomenal character. I can give you already a schema of the Dennett original argument, right? And I said there is really no such argument in this long paper from 1988, but I think it can be when you, I guess, process all the little stories and analogies and so on that he offers in that long paper, I think you can come up with something like this. This is the schema of the argument. First premise: qualia exist if and only if our conscious experience is a certain determinate way. It's one way or another, right? But a certain determinate way. Second premise is just the denial of this first premise. Our conscious experience is not a certain determinate way, right? That's how I understand those stories about the coffee tasters and other similar stories, right? There is no determinate way there is no moment where you can. So it's a denial. So the conclusion, therefore, qualia don't exist. So I think it can be really simplified to that, all right? And then I said that there are all these quotes, right? That's what I just read. That all these people who say like, we agree with this argument and its conclusion, right? But nevertheless, there are qualia in some, or maybe we don't even want to use that term anymore. But there is something. Let's call it now phenomenal character. Now we have the new term like phenomenal character. And there is something left after Dennett's critique, right? So as I said, I recognize something like that in the older book by Flanagan. I said that using different language, Michael Ty does that in his Morrison book, right? And then Carothers, right? And Bloch, right? And as I said, all these people disagree among themselves on many things, but they basically share this, right? So there seems to be this basic, consensus. And if we had a Czech-speaking presentation, maybe I could add our very own Tomáš and Michal Polák, who I'm told were presenting a paper here a couple of weeks ago. And I translated a couple paragraphs from their book on consciousness that they published last year. And they joined this rather distinguished company, right? Saying basically, again, like using somewhat different language, but basically saying same thing as Owen Flanagan and Michael Ty and Peter Carruthers and Ned Block. Namely, let's thank Dennett for his demolition work, but there is still something that is left after his critique, and that's where we want to concentrate our efforts on, right? So, but let's not go into that. But I'm just wondering what these deflationary qualia that all these people talk about, what they are, right? It seems that, all right, so in Flanagan we got this, the ways things seem, right? The ways things seem, right? In Michael Ty, you get properties of external surfaces that by means of being represented contribute to the phenomenal character of experience. In Carruthers, we get properties in virtue of which mental states become phenomenally conscious. In Block, you get phenomenal properties of experience that escape reduction to the intentional, the functional, and the cognitive. And Marman and Block, properties of conscious states that lend them their specific qualitative nature. So, is there something like resurfacing now as a phenomenal character? Do all these descriptions share something in common? I think they are, they are supposed to be different versions of, I guess, basic definition of phenomenal character, namely a property that I choose to define thusly, a property of an experience consisting in that there is something like it is to undergo the experience, right? And now my critique. How much time do I have? How much more time? 10 minutes. Oh, okay. All right. So let me go through the rest. All right. So that's how the discussion looks like. That's the state of the discussion right now. But does the concept of phenomenal character have any more definitive content to it than the traditional concept of qualium? I shall show you that in the remainder of this talk that it does not. This can be demonstrated by considering two popular strategies of fixing the content of the concept of phenomenal character as a deflationary qualitative property. I discuss both in detail in the book, so I assume some things, but hopefully it will be clear nevertheless. I believe that it can be shown that neither of these two strategies assigns a determinate content to the aforementioned concept, the concept of phenomenal character. The first strategy is suggested by the well-known thought experiments that pose the main challenge to contemporary materialists. Of course, I'm speaking of the David Chalmers's zombie argument, right? That I wonder if I have first premise, we can conceive that there is a creature that is my physical duplicate, but it lacks phenomenal characters, right? And if it's second premise, if it's conceivable, it is possible, right? And eventually leads to denial of physicalism. So that's the zombie argument. And the second most popular argument is Frank Jackson's so-called knowledge argument. Again, in the first premise, you start with the assumption that there is some information that is not deducible from a physical description of things, physical description of world, and that leads to the denial of physicalism as well. Right? So this is kind of well-known material, so I won't go into that. But right, these two thought experiments suggest a way of fixing the content of the concept of phenomenal character. So how does it go? So most materialists again take these two arguments very seriously. Most materialists accept the first premise of each of these arguments respectively. Most materialists think that it is indeed conceivable that zombies exist. It is indeed it is indeed true that there is some information that cannot be deduced from physical description, such as, for instance, information about how things feel, how things, what kind of phenomenal character they have, that cannot be deduced from physical description of things. So most materialistic this series, Dennett does not, right? But let's leave that aside. Chalmers' thought experiment suggests that deflationary qualia are the properties lacked by the physical and functional duplicate of a certain person. Jackson's thought experiment suggests that deflationary qualia are the properties unavailable to a person who lives in a colorless environment. Such phenomenal properties really appear to be weaker than the inflationary qualia, since it is unnecessary to interpret them dualistically as essentially intrinsic properties incapable of an objective description. In other words, it is not necessary to treat these properties as ontologically distinct. This would follow only on the condition that zombies were metaphysically possible and that Mary, outside the neuroscientist who spent most of her life in the black and white land, Jackson's famous thought experiment, that Mary, outside her black and white lab, discovered some new facts. But zombies could be merely conceivable, and Mary might discover only the well-known physical facts outside her laboratory. If so, nothing precludes the conclusion that deflationary qualia are in fact physical or functional properties. More precisely, they are the kind of physical properties that dispose us to characterizing our experience as intrinsic, subjective, ineffable, and all the rest of the list. Right? But dispositional properties are not qualitative properties. So it seems that the concept of deflationary qualia is still without content. That's my conclusion. At this point, a friend of deflationary qualia could invoke Chalmers' sophisticated conception of conceivability. As you might know, he draws so many distinctions, right? So many kinds of conceivability. So somebody could use this. As long as deflationary qualia are in fact physical properties, I'm unable to conceive of my duplicate lacking such physical properties. It just so happens that physical properties can present themselves in various ways, but their nature is identical in all possible worlds in which these properties are instantiated. However, when I'm conceiving of a phenomenal zombie, I'm conceiving of my physical duplicate, deprived of phenomenal properties. And in the case of terms that refer to such properties, there does not occur any split between the qualitative and the real nature, or as Chalmers puts it, between the primary and secondary intention of these terms. The primary and secondary intention coincides. So I cannot explain my ability to conceive of phenomenal zombies as if the terms in question refer in some other possible world to properties that are phenomenally different. And similarly, I cannot explain Mary's incomplete knowledge otherwise than by an inaccessibility of certain phenomenal concepts. A friend of deflationary qualia believes that this lends the concept of deflationary qualia, and hence the concept of phenomenal character, a specific content. However, I consider this defense of deflationary qualia unsuccessful. When I'm conceiving of a phenomenal zombie, a duplicate of mine who lacks supposedly phenomenal characters, I'm thinking of a creature whose experience lacks features such as intrinsicness, irreducible privacy, incorrigibility, and ineffability. This means that I'm conceiving of a creature whose mind lacks inflationary qualia. But again, what does remain of the concept of deflationary qualia if standard materialists agree with Dennett that he was right to eliminate inflationary qualia? If it was right to eliminate inflationary qualia, it seems that this concept completely exhausted the concept of qualia, period. Hence, it seems to me that there is no residual concept of deflationary qualia that survives Dennett's criticism. So that's the first strategy, right? Using these thought experiments to fix the content of the concept of phenomenal character. Second strategy, right? People don't have to give up yet. Second strategy, very popular, maybe the most popular among contemporary materialists, is that deflationary qualia or phenomenal characters, whatever you prefer to call them, can be identified demonstratively. Right? You can just point to that thing, right? That property. So, for example, this is what it's like when I experience the redness of red tomato, or that is the pain which I experience when I hit my head with a cupboard door in my kitchen. Right? That is the smell of fresh ground coffee. So I can use demonstrative identification. Right? A lot of people like that, and there are different versions. Some people are like, using token kind of demonstration. Others think that these terms, identify in terms of type demonstrative identification. Right. So I can just point to that thing. This is what it feels like. I can point to it. It appears that the demonstrative identification offers a direct way of how to capture phenomena, which is independent of any particular theoretical position. There is a following problem with this suggestion, though. The demonstrative identification could isolate the shared explanandum only on the condition that each party points to the properties of the same kind. This is where I guess, because I'm saying different people have in fact different opinions concerning what we are supposedly introspectively aware of. For example, Ned Block and, let's say, Colin McGinn and others assert that we are introspectively aware of properties of experience, right? Which is kind of, I guess, what you would expect, right? That there are some problematic properties of experience, and this is what you introspectively point to, right? But there are others, like Dretzky and Fred Dretzky and Michael Tye, who I quoted earlier, who hold that experience is fully transparent, it's see-through, right? So that if we introspectively target our own experience, then we in fact become aware of the properties, not of experiences, but of external objects of experiences. We could call these philosophers transparentists, whereas the former group would be called anti-transparentists. Hence, that's how they appear in my table that I showed you earlier. Transparentists explain further that introspection opens access to phenomenal character, but they deny that this should be understood as an access to properties of experience itself. Some transparentists regard introspection as a kind of displaced perception by means of which we perceive that something is so and so by means of perceiving something else which perfectly correlates with the former perception. So, easy example which Dretzky uses, my perception that I have high blood pressure I can tell, right? I can tell that I have high blood pressure by reading data on a monitor, right? That of an apparatus that monitors my blood pressure. According to this view, phenomenal character is an awareness of facts, not of properties. Let me skip that. All right. So the dispute. One more page. The dispute between transparentists and anti-transparentists is an obstacle for the suggested view, according to which a qualium is the object of demonstrative identification, since the given concept apparently identifies very different sorts of phenomena. People like Bloch, for instance, right, and others claim that it identifies the introspectively accessible properties of experience. On the contrary, people like Michael Tye and Dretzky and others believe that it identifies the properties of external objects. Right? So these are other two rather different sorts of things. So demonstrative identification is not clear. So at this point, someone might suggest that demonstrative identification isolates a shared explanandum, at least for the anti-transparentists, whether they are dualists or materialists. Yet this suggestion runs into a problem as well. I'll consider very briefly the proposal offered by David Rosenthal. who is an anti-transparentist. According to Rosenthal, experiences have introspectively accessible sensoric properties, which are the properties in virtue of which we classify the experiences in question. Sensory qualities of experience correspond to the physical properties of external objects that are the causal origin of experience. According to this view, it is then natural if we introspectively point to the sensory quality of experience on the basis of which we classify such an experience. We thereby isolate its phenomenal character. But Rosenthal claims that the states with sensoric properties need not be conscious. That's a rather absolute claim, which is, by the way, something that Tomáš subscribes to. That there could be phenomenal states that are not conscious, right? Rather strange view. This means that we could have, for example, an experience of color, but this experience would have no quality for us. That's weird. A sensoric state becomes conscious only when it is the object of a certain higher order thought, right? So Rosenthal is one of those higher order theorists, right? However, this means that sensoric qualities of experience are different kind of property from phenomenal character, from what it's likeness or raw feel or whatever you call it. Hence, if we point at the phenomenal character of experience, our attention should be directed not at the sensoric qualities of our experiences, but rather at the special qualities that appear only when the sensory qualities become the objects of thoughts of higher order. Yet this demonstrates that not even the anti-transparentists like Rosenthal agree on the object of demonstrative identification of phenomenal character. So, all right. So this is the basic. This is what I just told you. A scheme of what I've just told you. The different things that people consider to be objects of demonstrative identification, and this is the form of complete argument, including those the first strategy that was trying to use the two thought experiments, zombie experiment and Mary thought experiment. This is the form. This is, and I consider this to be an extension of Dennett's argument. So first premise, even though inflationary qualia do not, it has the form of reductio, by the way. Even though inflationary qualia do not exist, deflationary qualia, what people nowadays would prefer to call phenomenal characters, do. Second premise, phenomenal characters are either, these are two preferred strategies, either A, properties isolated by means of thought experiments, or B, the reference of introspective demonstration. Third premise. However, phenomenal characters are neither A, because they could be regular physical properties that just dispose us to ascribe to them certain weird features, nor B, because there is no agreement on what is the object of such demonstration. Conclusion. Deflationary qualia, aka phenomenal characters, do not exist. And now you might have noticed, since there are some rather distinguished logicians here, that this is not a conclusive argument, right? And I'm aware of it. It's not conclusive argument, because someone might say, well, we have not been successful so far with the strategies that we've been developing over the last few decades, such as, the one that works with the thought experiments and tries to fix the content of the concept of phenomenal character by means of those thought experiments, or the demonstrative identification of strategy. But I'm thinking that we are, time's running out, and there is no better strategy, and I mean, so much sophistication has been accomplished, or so much sophistication has occurred in the literature in the last few decades that I don't think that that is very hopeful that we will, I don't see anything here. So I think, I mean, I agree that this is inconclusive, right? We cannot say that this is a demonstration of, you know, the fact that there are no phenomenal characters in addition to being the fact that there are no inflationary qualia. But I think it points, at least it's an argument that suggests with a high probability that we will not get much further going down that road. So I think that we should leave that and maybe try Dennett's strategy. That's what I'm arguing in the book. So that's the conclusion of the argument and the extension of Dennett's argument. And this is the Polish. Thank you.
We have almost 25 minutes for the discussion and comments. So whoever wants to ask a question or raise a comment, a point of criticism, a question, a qualification form.
This may be just a minor terminological point, but you referred to deflationary qualia as explanandum. Is that it seemed, well, and this really isn't commenting on your final argument, it's just a puzzling way. I'm not sure why you set it up that way, because people who want deflationary qualia want them for the explanans, right? They're supposed to be part of the explanation of why something isn't in the physical world or something like that. And they get into the explanans precisely because nothing does explain them, right? They are not right? An explanandum is something that's typically at the end of a causal or a developmental chain. That's what it is to be.
What needs explaining.
It's something that needs explaining.
So yeah, in that sense,
right.
And so
the arguments for their existence are not explanatory arguments.
No.
So it just seems to mischaracterize in some way what the debate is about, to position them as target explanandum. Their role in the debate seems to me to be different.
No, I think that well, sometimes I'm confused after a long while. I'm confused, like, what is explained, what is explains. I'm confused about these things, but I don't think that I'm confused here, because these are attempts to identify things that need explaining, right? Deflationary qualia, whatever you call it, qualitative fields, phenomenal characters. These are things that need explaining. They are not doing the explanatory work. Things that do the explanatory work would be some functional and causal mechanisms.
But there is no explanation for the people who are committed to.
That's right.
They're in some way group, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
I think sets up a certain confusion to position it that way. Their metaphysical status in this argument is not. It's precisely that they can't be. They can't occupy the role of something that is explained, but they are used in the process of giving an explanation.
That's right, that for some people, namely dualists, right? We call them dualists. For dualists,
I'm not me, but I'm just talking about.
It's true that this is the end of the story, that we've identified these things that need explaining, but there is nothing in the whole wide world that could explain them and thus include them within the physicalist scheme of things, right? But I'm setting this up mostly from the materialist point of view. Most people are materialists, and for most people this is a challenge. These explananda were identified, right? Maybe by means of Chalmers's thought experiment or Jackson's Mary, the knowledge thought experiment, whatever. But for materialists, these are challenges. They are those things that need explaining, but they would use other terms intentional, meaning representational, functional, right, causal terms, and why so many people are representationists in philosophy of consciousness? Because it seems to me a lot of people think that that this is the strategy that worked on that in that other part of mind, namely the representational mind, the propositional states, and so on. I think that since 1970s or earlier until today, most people have come to agree that functionalism of some sort works as far as the propositional attitudes are concerned. So can't we somehow twist these conscious states, what we used to think were purely qualitative states, in such a way that they turn out to be representational after all? And then we could use the same strategy that worked with the propositional states, and we could take care of these what originally seemed to be purely qualitative states too. We can reduce them to represent using representational language, right? We could use them to representational states, and then they would be understood as playing some sort of functional role within the whole architecture of mind. So you would use functional terms, right? And then eventually causal terms, they play some causal role, and then there you have it, right? Materialism, the goal of materialism is accomplished. But yeah, I now understand like why it might have been confusing, because for dualists this is the end of the debate, right? For dualists, these are not things that need explaining because they are inexplicable, right? But for materialists, they pose a challenge.
No, I agree entirely that for materialists they are.
Yeah.
What is to be explained, right? But it kind of prejudices, right? The argument isn't, the argument you're interested in is between the materialists and the non-materialists, and their
or rather different positions within materialism. Right? I'm not so much concerned with dualism. Yeah. By the way, Tomáš Marwan, who we talked about on a couple of occasions earlier, pointed out to me that there is a special issue of Journal of Consciousness Studies on something called a position called illusionism, right? That conscious states are illusory, they are illusions, and the target paper was a paper by a philosopher that I did not know by the name of, maybe you guys have heard about him, Keith Frankish. Who lives in Malta or Cyprus? Or
he was in the dual process theory of mind, if I'm not mistaken.
I haven't read that one, and I haven't read other things. And I mean, Tomáš pointed out to me that a paper contributed to that volume on illusionism, paper contributed by Dennett, was online, and that I should read it. So I read it, but most other papers, and then eventually some manuscripts of papers by other people who contributed to that volume were online on their websites, respective websites, but I didn't have access to that volume of that journal because unfortunately we don't have subscription. But it's now it's been published. I don't know, a few weeks ago. It was published as a separate book. I haven't seen it yet. But I found other papers by Frankish, and his position is very similar to mine. So he's sort of like eliminativist, I guess, as far as phenomenal characters are concerned. But he uses somewhat different.
So it's not like visual.
He talks of diet qualia. I'm talking of that deflation qualia. He talks of diet qualia, diet code, right? So that's better, right? And I mean his argument is much more complicated and so on. But I like the similarity to it's kind of like demolition work that he prefers, right? That like all these people think that they agree on at least something that that we should focus on, but there is no such agreement really. That's the form of this argument.
I was afraid that you are talking about visual illusion because somebody could ask you what it feels like to have an illusion. That you mean illusion as a kind of cognitive illusion? Not as you don't mean it as an illusion in a conscious sense, because that would be a contradiction.
I haven't read that target paper in the Journal of Consciousness Studies that he wrote, that Frankish wrote, so I'm not exactly sure yet before I read it.
Because if it's
what he means.
conscious illusion, that would bring back the issue of.
But I think that I mean, what is sometimes I guess puzzling in this debate that it's very subtle. So I guess we can say that saying that phenomenal characters don't exist or something, it doesn't mean that I certainly would not go, and I think Dennett would not go as far as saying that, oh, we are zombies, we don't have consciousness. That's stupid, right? That's too quick. I think that Dennett would, and he does say so in the book that you said earlier, that it doesn't bring any original material. I think it does. One of the things, it has responses to these kinds of criticisms that he eliminates consciousness, and I think that he would say, like, we do have experiences, and but it just doesn't have the features that we think that it does have, right? So I think that's the purpose already in 1991 book of all these experimental results, right? That like use, I mean, well, there are so many, right? So their point is to demonstrate that you think that you have like completely like private person access to, I mean, the whole field of your experience or whatever, and that has all these features, and it just doesn't, and you can be mistaken. Science can be more accurate in describing what you experience, right? And so I think it's not a denial of consciousness, it's just denial of some inflated concept of consciousness.
Maybe somebody could have something in defense of qualitative experience in some more robust sense than Tomáš is willing to.
After this,
endorse.
possible.
So I have a question about the argument that you gave at the end. And I understand that you say, well, it's not dispositive, but at least it gives us some reason for thinking. But I wonder in particular, to be suspicious. But how much weight should we put on the thought that these states can't be the reference of introspective demonstration because there's no agreement on what the object is? It seems as though, and I was trying to think of an example in science, I couldn't come up with one, but suppose there were multiple people that saw the moons of Jupiter, and they were debating about what they were. They didn't know what those things were. But insofar as there's some phenomena that people can agree are out there, why isn't that enough? Why does there in addition need to be agreement on what the objects of the phenomena are?
I see. Oh, in astronomical phenomena, we assume that there are these things out there.
Yeah, you can imagine someone looking through Galileo's telescope and he's saying, look, watch, and then tomorrow I'll show you that little dot will be on the other side of Jupiter, and then it'll be on the other side of Jupiter 3 days later. It seems like insofar as there is, and maybe this person thinks, well, that's a dragon flying around, and Galileo says, no, that's a moon, like our moon. So there may be disagreement about what the objects are, but insofar as there's some phenomenon that people can agree is there to be explained, why isn't that enough?
I mean, in this area, do we have reason to think that there is this phenomenon somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
I even says like, it's the property of the surf it's this yellowness.
Or it's this sound that you're hearing,
And the others are saying, no, it's the property of your experience of the world. So it's not like, what reason do we have? It seems rather different from the astronomical.
I mean, so what is the qualitative experience of having a hand smack against the wall? It's this.
Well, is that enough? Like how you haven't given me much. Right. I mean, can you tell me more?
Sure, right? I can do things like it's different than this.
Yeah, and then if we compile enough reports, a lot of like you give us rich material, you give us heterophenomenological material, we can do the Dennett thing with that sort of material, right? We can say like to what extent you're really in control, to what extent your reports reports are accurate, whether they could be corrected and so on. But I don't see any point, like, I mean, I don't see that we would gain anything by introducing phenomenal characters into that.
Yeah, so I'm not a dualist, but here's an example that I think fits the case precedent. So if you go to I've had the experience to go to a doctor in the United States who deals with pain, like chronic pain, and these doctors will simply ask you to rate your pain on 1 to 10, right? And you choose to scale, you know, so that is you choose where, and this one doctor I like very much just said to me, he says, it's all Cartesian, you know. I mean, he's not going to try and create an objective measure of the pain, but each patient feels that they are rating something genuine, right? Even though, right, they can't, as it were, take it out and show it to you. Is that the sort of...
Yeah, that's the kind of thing.
So,
and I think
so you don't want to deny that their pain is genuine, and it has the measure for them that they indicate, even though you can't otherwise fasten on the object.
Yeah, I would certainly I would not deny that, but I would deny that they are the supreme authority on putting that experience on a scale, right? And that it has other features like those that people in the philosophical tradition ever since what's his name, the American philosopher who is not C.S.
C.I. Lewis, the given.
The first one who used the term qualia, but he was some sort of Kantian, so maybe it goes back, right? And so I would, and within that tradition, people would say things like, you are the supreme authority, and there is no third person access, and I think that we don't have to buy these things. We can. I mean, of course, we should concede that there are these processes that are going on inside you, and that you can report lots of things. But does that mean that this is beyond, scientific explanation? That it's incorrigible and has all these other features.
But now it sounds like you're giving arguments against the inflationary account of qualia. And I was thinking, grant all that, right? The inflationary account, problems with conceiving these things as incorrigible, completely personal to the individual even, maybe. But that still leaves open the possibility that if we conceive of qualia in this thinner sense, in this deflationary.
But what would that be, right? I mean, I thought that eventually people would get back to the privacy and intrinsicality or intrinsicness and whatever, and so it's back to inflationary.
So I'm not sure I agree. It doesn't seem to be obvious that has to be the case. And I guess I am sort of gripped by the sentiment that there is something that is like, think about the difference between a snare drum, a high tss, 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 and a bass drum, a thump, thump, thump. That there is something about those kinds of experiences that we don't want to lose in our complete picture of the way the world is.
Do I sense the seller's voice correctly?
Maybe. It's probably not correct, but
was that famous quote that in the complete description of the world as something you don't want to ignore the volumes of pink.
Yeah, pink ice cubes. Maybe pink ice cubes. But yeah, I mean.
Why is it so damn mysterious? Because especially if you talk of volumes, right? It seems that volumes are something measurable. So why couldn't they?
That's why, I mean, Jim O'Shea in his book makes the case that's why the ice cube is really important, because it's this three-dimensional thing. So the experience is this, it's of a thing that has depth and not just a surface.
So this is something that's discussed in the Sellersian literature.
Yes. Yeah.
So may I ask a methodological question? So what your position is? You probably do not deny something like phenomenal character of consciousness. Or would you deny that? It seems to me that
as long as I mean, there have been attempts, right? Some which I discussed. There have been attempts to give some determinate meaning to that term.
yeah, but subtracting subjectivity, intrinsicality,
they all fail. So I suggest that we leave that aside. That we don't think there is some irreducible residuum to our experiences once we've employed the whole battery of functional and causal reductions on everything.
That's what I'm
There is
trying to
nothing-
make clear. So what we would deny is that there is some irreducible stuff, mental stuff, which can be explained by usual methods like, or usual, I don't know if it's scientific method, but it's kind of framework like functionalism, computationalism, or something like that. So that's your position. Because obviously, intuitively, there is a difference between sensations and beliefs, for instance. Beliefs might be conscious or unconscious, they might have no qualitative character at all, but sensations obviously have some kind of qualitative feel to them. So you wouldn't deny that, you would just say, well, let's study them in scientific style.
We have mentalized and let's employ the standard methods of science in researching them, and let's not start with some assumption, oh, there is something irreducible, and you know. I should complete this. I don't have any positive view. I mean, so far, or I will never have, perhaps. But I'm just in the rest of the book. Once this demolition kind of work is done, which is an extension of Dennett's original argument. Once this extension to phenomenal characters, once this demolition work is done, I just try to somehow put in a system Dennett's views on his positive views on consciousness, and I specifically discuss some things that are maybe there. He has like scattered remarks over the years on these things, like specifically. Realism and idealism, is he realist and idealist? Right? I mean, he denies something, but does that mean that he denies everything? So what I think, and then I specifically concentrate on the connection between the topic of consciousness and the topic of intentionality, which of course in his work from 1980s and so on is that material on intentional stance. So I have some interest in because it's something similar to the standard materialism's attempt to reduce consciousness in terms of representational states, right? So I wonder, like, to what extent he's really similar to the standard materialists in that area.
Because it seems to me that virtually every naturalist has to say that if there is something like qualitative experience, well-defined phenomenon, it has to be studied in a scientific manner. Almost as it's not that surprising that you as a naturalist would argue against qualia if they are defined as something extra, something irreducible. But still it seems to me that scientists might investigate phenomenal character of consciousness, but they would just say, well, obviously it's not something that can't be explained. It's kind of mystery. You just have to find some way of approaching that.
Why is it helpful to use that terminology that has origins in Thomas Nagel and then...
Not qualia, but maybe something like... Phenomenal character is better, I don't know if it is, but it at least captures some kind of difference between, I don't know, sensations and some cognitive stuff or beliefs or processes.
I don't, unfortunately I'm not familiar with, I have read very little of the scientific literature on consciousness. I guess in our little philosophical coterie in this country, Tomáš Marwan, right? It's much better read in that literature. So, but from what I know, from what I've noticed in the little that I've read in that area, scientists, right, of consciousness, scientists, those people who do empirical research in consciousness, they use these terms like phenomenal and phenomenal consciousness and so on. But I've had my impression, My impression has been that sometimes it's rather confused. It's not very. I mean, I'm not sure if it's clear to them that what is
Then might be clear, but still, when I'm thinking about that, I just come with such distinction like there are some sensations, bodily sensation, and it has some feel to that, like for instance the examples of presence and so on. It's kind of different than, for instance, belief or something. So even a scientist, like scientist of mind, has to account for those differences. We may eventually describe that as the differences between qualitative or phenomenal states of consciousness and something which do not have these qualities. And then we can approach that in a scientific manner, hopefully, it seems to me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just beware, qualitative.
Well, certainly I'm not a fan of qualia as traditionally defined, with
Alright.
those attributes you mentioned.
So it'll still be like high. Good enough.
It seems to me that we are approaching the end of this last talk of the LMS Center today, so thanks again, Tomáš.
Thank you.
And a happy Christmas to all of you.